Well, hello, this is Rain Grant with the Colorado Mushroom Company, as well as the president of the Psychedelic Club of Durango. And we're here in Town Hall, and we're about to have a meeting with the Department of Revenue discussing the recent passing of Proposition 122. And I'm looking forward to seeing what the discussion is all about.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Ben Florine, and I'm Chief Deputy Clerk with the City of Durango. And we're really excited tonight to be hosting a town hall on natural medicine with the Colorado Department of Revenue and their new division, the Natural Medicine Division. And so we really appreciate the Department of Revenue coming down to our corner of the state. Just being in the clerk's office, I know how important our statewide governmental agencies are and the partnerships we have between them and being able to work together to bring these opportunities down to Durango. So we really appreciate Heidi and Dominique coming out and their team joining us for today and tomorrow for some valuable regulatory information. And with that, I'll introduce Dominique.
Great. Thank you, Ben. Great. Thank you, and Allison, if you want to come join me as well. Good evening. Thank you all for being here. And I know we are recording and live streaming as well, so we'll be attached to our podium here. But really appreciate this opportunity to see both familiar faces and some new faces, and the value that comes with traveling to come to other parts of the state and make sure we're engaging with our broad set of stakeholders and ensuring we're looking at perspectives from all angles, and much of that comes from our direct engagement with all of our diverse set of stakeholders. My name is Dominique Mendiola, and I serve as the Senior Director for the Department of Revenue's both Marijuana Enforcement Division as well as the new Natural Medicine Division.
Hello everyone, my name is Allison Robinette. I serve as the Director of Policy and Regulatory Affairs for both the Natural Medicine Division and the Marijuana Enforcement Division.
Great. And also, we just want to introduce our other colleague from the Department of Regulatory Agencies, Sam Bahrami.
Hey, I'm Sam. I'm the Senior Advisor on Natural Medicine Services for the Department of Regulatory Agencies.
Thank you so much. We'll be hearing more from Sam in a bit this evening. Also, thank you, Ben, to you and your team at the Durango City Clerk's Office for organizing this event, helping host this for us, and just partnering with us and our team on these efforts. Thank you so much for that. All right, so our focus this evening is on natural medicine, and the focus around natural medicine has been more specifically on psilocybin or psilocin, so magic mushrooms. But this program and these changes in the law do touch on more than psilocybin, so we do want to get more into that. We do have other engagements this week, as Ben had noted, including tomorrow. We are going to be more focused on our work within the Marijuana Enforcement Division. Tonight we really do want to focus on our work related to natural medicine. This is a brand new program with significant changes in the law that we want to make sure we are helping inform and create awareness around and addressing questions around. Even if we are not necessarily able to answer those questions in this moment, we want to make sure that we are understanding what questions folks have so that that informs our work, whether it's FAQs that we're developing, how we are coming forward with other stakeholder engagements, town halls, or listening sessions that we have been holding. We're going to be jumping more into that detail as well. So we appreciate, as we get into more dialogue with folks who are here, we want to hear from you, whether it's questions or your perspectives on how we should be approaching our work around natural medicine, and specifically the regulatory program that we are standing up in partnership with the Department of Regulatory Agencies and other partner agencies like our public health partners at the state level. So more on that. Oh, thank you. All right. So we're going to kick it off with just some high-level overview, some historical context on where this all began. This began through a voter initiative, as you can see on our slides here. That was Proposition 122, where it passed by voters in November of 2022. So Sam Bahrami is going to speak more about that in a bit here, so people get more into detail on the context around Proposition 122 and how that informed DORA's work. And We're going to pivot over, though, to the subsequent legislation that followed Proposition 122, and that's Senate Bill 290. And so that bill just passed this last legislative session, and that's where the Department of Revenue comes in. But before we get into the work of our agency and DORA, we also want to just touch on some changes that relate to personal use provisions in the law around natural medicines. So natural medicine touches, I mentioned, psilocybin and psilocin, and that's the initial focus in our regulatory program space. But as it relates to the personal use provisions, natural medicine includes additional substances. And so that includes psilocybin, psilocin, ibogaine, mescaline, but not from peyote, and DMT. So that is the full scope of what applies to these personal use provisions and that are currently effective in the law. So as you can see there is a personal cultivation allowance and a private residence. And so with that, there is a restriction on the space that can be used in a private residence for purposes of personal cultivation of natural medicines, and that cannot exceed 12 by 12 feet. Does not have to be contiguous, so it can be separate parts of a private residence. However, it has to be in an enclosed and locked space. And so in private property, and private property is defined in the law further, but that enclosed and locked space, if there is no one under 21 in that household, in that private residence, then that private residence is that enclosed and locked space. That said, if there's access and anyone under 21 living in the private residence, then that does require some additional restrictions to ensure you're preventing access to those underage. And I want to be clear, this is not legal advice. If you do have specific legal questions, it is important to consult with qualified legal counsel, but we are speaking to the provisions in the law based on our review as the Department of Revenue, but again, this does not constitute legal advice. Okay, so getting back to the provisions here. So the local authority in your jurisdiction can exceed that personal use cultivation space. So beyond that, unlike cannabis in the law, there is not a personal possession limit for natural medicines. Anyone who is 21 and up can possess natural medicines and may also share natural medicines. You cannot sell it, so not for remuneration, as it's referred to in the law, so no transaction, no money exchange, anything along those lines. But you can share, as you see on the slide there, in the context of counseling, spiritual guidance, community-based use, supported use, or related services. That can sound general or broad, and I think there's more work we can do to support in our engagement with our law enforcement partners and our engagement with members of the community. How are we navigating that and making sure we're providing appropriate guidance and consistency in that? Also, I mentioned there's no remuneration. Now there is an exception there, as you see on the slide, except for bona fide harm reduction or support services used concurrently with sharing. It's just a matter of not selling the natural medicine or engaging in another sort of exchange transaction. No open and public display or consumption, similar to our cannabis laws. And there are offenses that were established in Senate Bill 290 that really mirror the low-level offenses that you see applying to cannabis here in Colorado. All right, so our next slide here. Thank you. Okay. Regulatory program, or do you want to touch on this, please?
And this slide was up at the beginning, so you all probably had a chance to review it, but just wanted to quickly touch on how natural medicine within the regulatory framework is going to look a little bit different than what we see in the cannabis regulatory framework, where we have dual licensing between the state and local jurisdiction. It's different for natural medicine, where the law specifically does not allow a local jurisdiction to prohibit the operation of these facilities, but a local jurisdiction can certainly enact time, place, manner restrictions. So one way we can envision seeing that play out would be through zoning ordinances that say, this is where you can have a healing center. and other types of restrictions like how long those businesses can be open during the day, things like that. So all things that we will be working with our local partners to support their implementation on this front, but recognizing there's more restrictions on what locals can do in this space than in the cannabis space. And then also just starting to dive more into what the Department of Revenue is doing and how we ended up here. So under Senate Bill 290, the Department of Revenue is going to be responsible for licensing and regulating healing centers, cultivation facilities, manufacturing facilities, and testing facilities. Part of the thought process, I believe, for this sort of shift in responsibilities to the Department of Revenue is our experience in the cannabis space, where we are regulating very similar facilities and businesses. So we can leverage that experience and the knowledge we've gained from the past 10 years plus of that regulatory sort of oversight and experience. Some of the high-level responsibilities that we're going to be implementing include a full testing program. If you've been tuned into the listening sessions, you know that this is an area we're starting to focus on. Additionally, data collection that includes law enforcement incidents, adverse health events, behavioral health impacts, and impacts on the healthcare system overall. A lot of these topics that we're touching on today, as we'll both say expressly, but also just understanding that this is going to require a lot of coordination with other state, local, private organizations because of the broad scope of this work, and also the unique nature of the law here in Colorado. Just a couple more things to touch on. Public education campaigns was directed to the Department of Revenue as well. This is an area that we will be leaning heavily on our state agency partners because education campaigns are not typically something that our agency has been directly responsible for. And also given the nature of this space with natural medicine, the health impacts, the potential health benefits, those are all things that need to be informed what we're educating people about and when. So those are important, as well as training materials for first responders. Again, these are topics that we're already starting to focus in on our implementation, as well as annual reporting that we'll be doing in coordination with DORA, laid out in statute, but those things that are going to hold the agencies accountable for how this law is implemented.
Great, and so the regulatory structure that is established in Senate Bill 290 includes the stand-up of a new natural medicine division within the Department of Revenue. And just to take a step back and touch on the framework we have that applies to our cannabis regulatory framework is we have the state licensing authority. And that includes other, like the Liquor Enforcement Division also has the state licensing authority. And the state licensing authority is the executive director of the Department of Revenue, and that's Heidi Humphreys. So you have Heidi Humphreys here joining us. And so the state licensing authority serves a really important role as it relates to our stand-up of this regulatory program, specifically in rulemaking. So in our cannabis regulatory space, we engage in regular rulemaking that may oftentimes happen after new legislation passes. So every legislative session, we oftentimes see cannabis legislation that directs changes to the regulatory framework that we within the Marijuana Enforcement Division are responsible for implementing. And that oftentimes includes rulemaking. And that is a stakeholder-driven process. We need to make sure we have diverse perspectives around the table, helping inform our development of rules. And that's from community members, industry members, law enforcement, public health professionals, the emergency response perspective, child advocacy groups. And so making sure we're looking at issues from all perspectives. Another really critical stakeholder is our local partners. And so we want to make sure we're bringing all those voices together to inform. Sometimes it's reacting to rules that we are initially developing in a draft form. And then that informs how we refine those rules, or if we even keep those rules in place. And we present that at the end point of our rulemaking process at a final rulemaking hearing. And that's that last point to get public input on our regulations before they go to the state licensing authority for final consideration and determining what is ultimately adopted into our rules. And that are then in place, they have an effective date. We help that lead up through different resources to support that compliance. And then we start engaging in any sort of beyond outreach education to support compliance proactively. That requires also inspections, investigations, making sure that we are doing our regulatory work and meeting our obligations around ensuring compliance and sometimes enforcement where necessary. So in this space, as we stand up the Natural Medicine Division, it's a pretty similar framework as we are speaking about the rulemaking process. And so we are going to get more into detail on our rulemaking schedule for natural medicine that we will be really encouraging any interested party to be a part of the conversation to inform our development of these first set of rules. So we're also going to be looking at, for example, what Oregon is doing, because they have a regulatory program. It's not exactly the same, but I think there's a lot, we agree that there's a lot we can learn from our partners in Oregon. So we look forward to that. But as we look at the role of the state licensing authority, it really touches on that authority to do the final adoption of rules, as well as when we are taking any sort of enforcement action, like a disciplinary action in our regulatory space, we are essentially proposing certain actions to the state licensing authority and explaining why we believe that this action should move forward. And that's ultimately determined by the state licensing authority, as well as how those proceedings are resolved, whether it's through a settlement or otherwise, or to a hearing, because there's a due process procedure, obviously, that is a part of that. And so you can also see the law 290 directs some other considerations and really expectations of how we're standing with this program. So that's that we are looking at our implementation through the lens of an equitable and inclusive program, as well as what are we doing to ensure that we're considering and taking measures to prevent youth access. Also, production management. This is like thinking about our cannabis experience. What measures are we taking? And maybe I imagine that there are going to be some big distinctions in the production process, cultivation and manufacturing. But what sort of measures are we putting in place to monitor that and ensure that we are addressing any sort of risks around overproduction that could lead to diversion? And so those are things that we are also expected to address. And then finally, measures to prevent exploitation and commercialization, because this is, unlike cannabis, it is really a commercial program where folks can go to dispensaries and purchase cannabis. This is not the same. There will not be natural medicine dispensaries. There will be healing centers, and we're going to get more into detail on exactly what that looks like. All right. So I talked about our rulemaking, and the law directs specific subjects on which we must engage in rulemaking. And so that is mandatory rulemaking, and we have permissive rulemaking. Mandatory rulemaking will be that priority of the base subjects that we need to hit on in our regulations. So that would be an initial focus in our rulemaking process. We also have a set of permissive rulemaking subjects that can be complementary to the rules that we see as mandatory or that we have identified as just critical to the initial stand-up of this program. And that this is also an iterative process. And so when we go through the first process of initiating rulemaking and get even to that final point of adopting rules, just as we have in cannabis, we go back and we examine what we've done, where we see gaps, what have we learned, what have we heard from stakeholders to inform another later round of rulemaking. But always want to be really thoughtful about how we're looking at the implementation, because it's wanting to avoid such a constant change that it creates potential compliance challenges. So what are we doing to support that process as well? And so that's a process that is ultimately, as I mentioned, guided by the state licensing authority. And we touched on other requirements and limitations, including our work with, and Sam Bahrami will get into this, but we're expected to engage and partner with the Natural Medicine Advisory Board, appointed by the governor, and those meetings are facilitated by DORA, so Sam will get into that. But we expect recommendations to come from the board, and as we engage in rulemaking, we'll be consulting with the board to make sure that we're also getting input from those board members, in addition to our other broader stakeholdering.
So this is a lot of information, and you saw on the slide, we will be accepting applications starting in December of 2024. So our runway is long, which is very good, but also there's a lot of work to be done. And so if you've been tracking our work so far, we've been sharing the sort of anticipated or ideal implementation timeline. And we focused this part of 2023 and through the end of this year really on more of that fact-finding, information gathering by holding listening sessions. We've held 5 so far. We'll walk through those in a moment. And we're planning more for November and December, spending more time really digging into the details that can then inform our more formal official rulemaking process. And these are touching on things beyond just our mandatory rulemaking that Dominique was just talking about, but really thinking about some of those other responsibilities that we are needing to implement sooner rather than later. For example, public education. So where we're at right now, we have started coordinating with other state agencies. We're trying to get out into the communities, make sure people are aware of these changes in the law, working with other partners to make that broader awareness available. And then also, in the background, we're working on resources and how can we inform these conversations we're having. We'll be looking at our official rulemaking starting ideally anticipated, hopefully, in March of 2024, but we have time. So there are certain statutory requirements in the law that say if you're going to do official rulemaking, you have this amount of time and these are the steps you must meet. So in order for us to achieve this December effective date for our rules, we have until late summer to do that. We want to start earlier than that. We want to give ourselves enough time. We want to hear from the public as much as we can on everything so that we can at least start in as good of a place as possible. So where we're really looking at having rules effective is by the beginning of October 2024. That's a year from now. That idea is that we can then have a few months for people who want to submit applications to prepare the materials they'll need for that, to make their plans and understand what's going to be expected of them, not only for applications, but also then for compliance once licenses start being issued in 2025. So again, what you're looking at here is what we hope to accomplish, but always subject to change as we get further into these conversations and inevitably discover something we hadn't thought about before that we need to shift and focus on in part of our rulemaking and implementation work. So we're going to talk about our listening sessions. All of these were recorded, all of the slides that we presented, the recordings, as well as the agendas with discussion topics and questions are available on the National Medicine Division website. So you don't need to furiously take notes on what we say here, that you can find other resources. But Dominique, go ahead.
Yes, so I'm just going to hit on looking at some of our notes from our session, just highlighting some of the takeaways and the subjects that we focused on in our sessions, and Allison is going to take some of the later sessions that we've more recently held. Our very first session that we held was essentially, it was more a presentation than like the feedback piece. We wanted to frame the conversation about the work that we're doing, what sessions are ahead, and what we want to hear from people around. We gave a high-level overview of the program, similar to what we touched on here, and that touched on both the regulatory work that we're doing as well as personal use provisions. We recognize we will not have jurisdiction over personal use, cultivation, but we see this as an opportunity because there were pretty significant changes in the law to support enhanced awareness about these provisions, and seeing opportunities to just support that overall work in partnership with the community and other organizations. So we focused on that in our first session. The second session we held focused on first responder training. And so this is an area that is, we mentioned, the Department of Revenue is responsible for developing. We expect that a lot of this work we're doing, as Allison had touched on, will be in collaboration with our partners at our other state agencies, local partners, other organizations, to make sure that we're leveraging all the resources and experience, that we're not recreating the wheel where we don't need to be doing that. And so the focus touched on as well, we anticipated a focus in certain areas like training materials for local law enforcement and EMS response purposes. We also, though, learned from those listening sessions about other areas we should focus on. That included, for example, veterinarians and where they're, as well as mental health professionals intervening in scenarios.
Teachers were another one of how we can inform teachers so that they can be talking about it in classrooms.
Yes, thank you. And public education campaigns. So there is some, like as we are engaging in these sessions, seeing some areas of overlap where, you know, something we're hearing in one session is going to be really helpful to other work in another session. So we really appreciated the feedback we've had in these sessions. They've only been an hour long, and that time flies by quickly. And we're looking at already in like future sessions we announce, providing more time for more discussion, looking at other areas we need to dive into, and even seeing where we can introduce an in-person element while still maintaining that hybrid virtual element. But public education, the session that we held in our third session, we, again, are responsible for developing public education materials and campaigns, which, again, we anticipate will be in partnership with other agencies. We're starting to think about different resources for different groups, so target audiences, where do we prioritize that focus? We also looked at, for example, pharmacists in the conversation and focusing on educational materials for hospitals and healthcare workers. Another key takeaway was our need to continue to keep in mind the historical and traditional use of these medicines. And as an attendee put it, pulling in legacy experts to help inform that educational information that we're developing. Do you want to touch on our fourth?
Yeah, so our fourth session was about the testing program. I hit on this a little bit. You know, we had some very specific questions, right, of starting to dig into what should we be testing, when should we be testing. And what we heard from folks was really interesting about shelf stability. Also looking ahead as, you know, what may be emerging areas of test needs that may not be directly relevant to psilocybin, but may be relevant to some of the other types of natural medicine. So are we thinking about heavy metal testing? Are we thinking about solvent testing if there are going to be manufactured products? So there's the testing program is going to likely shift and evolve as we learn more about all of these products. And as we've seen in the cannabis space as well, the evolution and innovation of the types of products based on both facilitators' needs and wants of what they want to offer to participants, as well as what participants feel comfortable taking. So those are all going to be considerations. And then our last session that we held just yesterday was on cultivation and manufacturing practices, and really starting with hopefully grounding that there's a lot of historical traditional knowledge, and how can that inform what we are starting to put into a regulatory framework? Or where is it not appropriate for that to be part of the regulatory framework? We have to balance those considerations. And again, as Dominique was mentioning, seeing how all these topics are intertwined, right? So we heard a lot yesterday about shelf stability and the degradation of psilocybin in products. That seems much quicker than maybe some of us, myself included, anticipated. And so how does that inform both the testing conversation we're having, but also how cultivation practices or processes may inform those testing considerations? So again, all of this is very intertwined. As we will dig into in November and December with additional sessions, we might look to bucket some of these together. Maybe testing and cultivation really should go together, and perhaps we can start pulling in other topics like data collection and inventory tracking, packaging and labeling, all of those things that will have to be part of this very comprehensive regulatory program.
Thank you. And another item, just as a flag that we touched on yesterday in the cultivation and manufacturing session, Allison had mentioned inventory tracking, so we did briefly touch on that, and that's an area that we know we're going to need to dive into further. We don't anticipate it mirroring exactly what we have for cannabis, the inventory tracking system we have there. It's a different, there are different expectations. And we also want to explore what other practices there are for inventory tracking in cases of needs for like recalls if there's an adverse health event. What does the public health department do, our partners in public health, when it comes to food products, food manufacturing? So we want to make sure that we're looking at all of those practices and standards to inform our work with that through this lens of public health and safety, best practices, operability for operators as well, and anticipating how that informs compliance challenges and how we learn and adjust and support overall compliance on that front. In addition to how are we supporting any sort of interaction between law enforcement and licensed operators in this space. And so similar to what we have in cannabis is expectations around a manifest. For example, when a regulated transfer is being conducted from one facility to another facility, And so if there is an interaction with law enforcement, how are we supporting that in a way that we're engaging directly and making sure that our law enforcement partners understand what expectations there are and requirements on the regulatory side, and what avenues are there to verify with us or through other mechanisms that this is a legal, regulated, license transfer between facilities. And so that's another area we really are going to need to dive into.
Just before we pass it over to Sam to talk about DORA as a role of the board, I did want to just mention, I see some faces here that I've seen on my little Zoom camera from our listening sessions, and so appreciate all of your engagement and participation and helping inform this conversation. It's really critical that we're hearing, as Dominique said at the beginning, from as many different voices as possible.
Thank you. And as Sam's making his way up here, just want to touch again on DORA's role, and we'll get more into this, but related to facilitators. So we expect there to be overlap in our regulatory work and need for close coordination. For example, if there's a scenario, because DORA is licensing and regulating facilitators, those individuals that will be administering natural medicine in a regulated setting, that could occur at a healing center, which is what we regulate, what we license and regulate. So if it's occurring in a healing center, that's what we want to make sure that we're coordinating very closely, but those sessions can occur at other locations. So, handing over to Sam.
Thank you, Dominique and Allison. For those of you who just joined us, I'm Sam Bahrami. I'm the Senior Advisor on Natural Medicine Services for the Colorado Department of Regulatory Agencies. I've been with the agency since January. I've been the Acting Program Director for the board since April of this year. So briefly, I'll touch on DORA, our agency. So DORA is the state's umbrella regulatory authority and consumer protection agency. Our department regulates more than 50 industries in the state of Colorado, which is achieved through the administration of over 40 boards, commissions, and advisory committees, and the hard work of nearly 700 staff members. In short, we license 1 in 7 people in Colorado's workforce and regulate more than 100,000 businesses and institutions. We strive to establish a regulated marketplace where responsible professionals and businesses can thrive in an equitable environment while maintaining guardrails for consumer protection. So I'm going to touch on 122 in the Natural Medicine Health Act and where the board was prior to 290 briefly. So last November, Colorado voters gave to DORA an additional regulatory program for natural medicine as defined by Proposition 122. With a respective advisory board to provide the state with recommendations on the rules to be adopted. A few key timelines that came with Proposition 122 were January 31st, 2023, the governor would appoint our initial natural medicine advisory board. We had our Senate confirmation in March of that year, of this year. And then September 30th, 2023, as of Prop 122, the National Medicine Advisory Board would have to have submitted the initial recommendations to the agency for the licensing of healing centers, cultivators, testing requirements, the safety pieces for emergency response, safety and ethics. And then by September 30th, 2024, DORA would have had to adopted all of the rules for that. I think some key pieces on there were data retention, testing requirements, cultivation, the licensing of the premises for healing centers. We're quite unfamiliar to DORA, new program. I think a couple other things in 122 that the board in 2026 would have to evaluate DMT, ibogaine, mescaline-based natural medicines. That's excluding peyote. That has changed since 290. I think ibogaine has been pulled from the personal use. The board is still going to evaluate ibogaine. Right now we're focused on psilocybin services. I think for the subcommittees, the differences in the natural medicines might require different training requirements, which could look a little different in the coming years. But I want to touch on the board prior to 290. We had 6 subcommittees. Our 6 subcommittees started, I think it was April 13th, at a full board meeting. The 6 that we had, and we have currently 5, we merged 2 of them. But the first was qualifications, licensing, and training, which is focused on facilitator training curriculum, facilitator occupational tiers, dual licensure considerations when it comes to advanced degrees or licenses that require certain levels of practicum and hours, and creating an equitable model to incentivize the licensure. Products research and data, which is focused on identifying cultivation, production, testing, and distribution standards. Emergency response safety and ethics, which is focused on EMS, law enforcement response and training, the facilitator ethics and ethical code associated with it, and the standards for the new occupation. We also had indigenous and religious use and outreach, which is focused on minimizing the commercialization of sacred medicines, protecting federally recognized tribes and indigenous communities and their rights to the access of the natural medicines. We had harm reduction and public safety, which focused on public awareness, access, and accountability. And we had public health and health equity, which is working to identify barriers related to access to care across the state, not just the Front Range, but rural Colorado as well, creating equitable funding mechanisms for business licenses, breaking down insurance barriers. I think the key thing to note from 122 is we had this September 30th deadline for this year, which we passed and no longer have. I think the main deadline we have now with 290 is that we have to begin accepting licenses no later than December 31st, 2024. I think we're trying to align our rulemaking period as closely with D.O.R.A. In this process. I think, let me pull up. Sorry guys, I'm really bad at public speaking. So a lot of ums coming in. But with 290, DORA is focused on the establishment of the licenses, the registration, training requirements, and the curriculum for the educational pieces for the new occupation, as well as financially feasible licensure structure, procedures, policies, and programs, as well as disciplinary actions, cease and desist orders, maintaining an online public list of licensees, registrants, including whether the person had its credentials limited, suspended, or revoked, and publishing an annual report. So when we first established the board in April, we had a really short deadline. I think it was like 5 months. So our 6 subcommittees were meeting twice a month for 2 hours. So that added up to roughly around like 13 meetings a month, including the full board meeting for 6 subcommittees. And then post 290, we moved that down to once a month, longer periods of meetings, which allowed us to integrate non-voting participants, experts in these specific subject matter areas, specifically associated with the licensing piece. Maybe I've spoken to Allison and Dominique, also spoken to Oregon facilitators, testers, cultivators, trying to learn as much as possible and integrate them into our meetings and discussions to help the board create recommendations and learn from what's working there and what's not. But I think that's generally where we are with 122, post 122. But we're anticipating recommendations from the board to be submitted to the agencies in early 2024. It's still a moving target, but I think the work has really come together, but there's still a lot to get done, and I think the listening sessions and participation like this has been really helpful. A lot of feedback from experts and people who've been working in this field for so long have been really insightful and really helpful for the recommendations, and we look forward to working with you on this process as we get the licensing up. So I think that's mainly it. I can touch more on the licensing pieces, but right now I think for the licensing structure, we've looked at 2 different pathways, and I can pull up a licensing model or share that out later. It's still in a draft format, but we're looking at 2 different licenses. One is a single license facilitator, and then that can include someone who might be indigenous or be in that holistic wellness space, spiritual space, as well as dual licenses at DORA. So that could be people with, could be a pharmacy tech, massage therapist, these other licenses that don't have independent authority to evaluate, treat, and diagnose participants. I think we have some further discussions, and look, I think it makes sense to also get feedback from the other boards of DORA as the recommendations go. Get it finalized a little more. I think the Med Board's meeting in November, so we'd like to get some feedback on how this might interact with someone who might be a physician or a psychiatrist who's looking to get a facilitator license, and how that might interact, and how do complaints get processed, and which board has authority or program has authority on enforcement actions. Those are things we're still trying to figure out, but it's an ongoing process. So, thanks.
All right, so a couple of other points we can make, and we want to hear from you all if you have any comments, questions that we can try to address, or that we can take back and follow up with. Just prepare for that. We want to hear from you if you'd like to share anything. But just some reminders on how you can access information, including our listening sessions. To date, we have recorded all of the D.O.R.A listening sessions on each of the subjects that we just covered. Those are all accessible. The video recordings are accessible. All the materials that we use, the presentation materials for those meetings, the agenda, so that is all available to you. We have a new Natural Medicine Division website, and so if you go there, that is there's a place right on that front page for you to sign up and get updates from us. We would encourage you, if you are not signed up, to please sign up so that you know what we're working on when we are initiating our rulemaking officially, so that you can be a part of that process as you'd like to, and also so you can continue to track and participate in our listening sessions, even if you just want to listen in to them. Even though the listening session is intended for us to listen to you all, but we recognize some people are learning about this just as we are, and they have been really informative. So we welcome your attendance and engagement in that process and really encourage it. We've had so many good sessions and feedback that we've received, resources that we've learned about from stakeholders already engaged in the process. So we want to build on that success as we lead up to another round. I know we've had 5 listening sessions hosted by the Department of Revenue, and we brought in other agency partners to present information as well to inform the dialogue that we then dedicate the rest of our time to. And so we are excited to begin looking at another round of dates that we can hold another set of listening sessions as we lead up to that formal rulemaking process. So again, please go to our website and sign up to get those updates and be a part of the process. Anything else to touch on the board?
No, I just am looking forward to hearing from you all. If there are questions that are sort of burning in your mind, anything others in your community also want to know about, that's what we want to hear, and that's what we are really looking for, so we can start really developing some, like Dominique said, resources for folks. Yes?
Is this proposition citywide, countywide, or statewide?
So the question was whether the proposition was city, county, or statewide, and it was a statewide proposition.
Okay.
Thank you. Yes?
Yeah, so what are your healing centers look like?
So, no, good question, and that's an area that we are wanting to learn about more in our listening sessions. session. So what do healing centers look like? We anticipated, and I think, Sam, as you heard from the board members as well, want to hear what thoughts you have on this, because I think there has been a lot of conversation around sort of the environment and the fact that these administration sessions are not just limited to healing centers. They can also happen at, a facilitator can also hold the administration session at a private residence or at another approved location. So that hasn't been fully defined yet, but it does call out private residence. So the regulations that we are looking to establish will have to, like for both of our agencies, we'll need to contemplate what sort of distinctions will we need to consider for purposes of sessions at a healing center? What sort of environments would we expect somebody who wants to operate a healing center, whether it's a facilitator or somebody else who's working with facilitators? What are the interests and what do we expect participants, those adults 21 and up who want to be a part of this process and have an experience with natural medicine in a regulated environment at a healing center? What are those expectations or those environments that participants are going to be looking for, and could see it vary, but also what are the considerations that in regulation we need to keep in mind for purposes of a session at a private residence, which could be very different risks potentially, so we want to consider that. But a healing center we anticipate could look maybe like sort of clinic based, or it could look very different. There could be group sessions as well, so a healing center could look to accommodate that sort of group environment. So it really still remains to be seen in an area that we need to have more, get more feedback around, so that we are thinking about how our regulations are keeping pace with what those environments are going to look like. And also, what are those base expectations for any healing center and for any session, any administration session? Do you want to jump in on it?
Yeah, I think that was an excellent question. And we know in Oregon that facilitation takes place only at a service center, healing center, and the licenses for those centers are associated with them. The language was pretty broad. So we considered base safety requirements, or the board has discussed that, but we're just now diving into what does a facilitation look like outside of a healing center. Not out in public, but what is the cause that a facilitator would need to travel to someone's home? What are the safety requirements there? How does someone screen for that? What is part of a facilitation, right? We know it's like 3 parts. It's a preparation session, an administration session, and an integration session. The preparation session is that informed consent. That's where the facilitator speaks with the person seeking the services, learns a bit about their background, and this also dives into the licenses as well, whether someone might be a higher risk, right? Might need to go to a healing center that might have physicians or other medical staff, medically trained staff present. So we're still considering that. I think that'll definitely be part of our discussion for the Emergency Response Safety and Ethics subcommittee next Wednesday, actually at 1 o'clock, and I can send that link to folks as well. But it's still under consideration. I think it could be broad in what a healing center might look like. We've seen in the unregulated market around the country and what happens in South America, right? There are retreat centers where people stay, and they might not just do a facilitation, right? It might be like a retreat where they're doing yoga or other events, but it's still stuff that the board is trying to work out on those base requirements.
And for all facilities, because the Department of Revenue is going to be licensing and regulating those facilities, whether administration session happens at a healing center or another location, like somebody's residence. And I mean, you can think about scenarios like end-of-life type scenarios as well, beyond somebody maybe just wanting to have that experience in the comfort of their home.
And so we're working through all those considerations, but really that ties as well as when it involves something outside of the healing center, a lot of work that the board and Sam and his team are navigating right now. And another reason, an example why we need to have these types of stakeholder engagements and make sure that we're learning about all those perspectives and things that we should be thinking about, like what are we not talking about and thinking about that we need people to bring to our attention. But we do have base requirements that we know we're going to be considering for any entity, whether it's a healing center, a cultivation, or manufacturing facility, or security, surveillance requirements. We have requirements in the cannabis space for facilities, but we also need to be sensitive to how this is different when you're talking about a healing center where these administration sessions are occurring, where we may need to look at some distinctions between that and security and surveillance that would apply to a cultivation or manufacturing facility. Yes?
Will you regulate or limit how many licenses are issued across the state?
How many licenses will be
issued? Yeah.
Like how many do we anticipate?
Yeah, or are you going to put a cap on it? I mean, like X amount, or
so that it's another good question, and something that we also have rulemaking authority to establish restrictions around. There's one restriction in the law already that ties to individuals who have a financial interest in any one of these entity licenses, that you cannot have more than 5 of them. So you can't have a financial interest in any more than 5 of these licensed facilities. For production management purposes, that's really where we look at options around potential, production restrictions or caps on number of licenses. We have authority like that applies to our cannabis framework. We do have authority in statute around cannabis to establish a cap on the number of licenses that can be issued. We haven't used that because we've managed production through limits on what somebody can cultivate. So those production limits is a part of managing it. So we'll need to explore how we look at that and approach this in a very different space for natural medicines, whether that's caps or other production management measures.
And just follow up to that, is that going to be regulated by the state, or is it like local licensors going to have some regulation control over that? Or?
So it is very different where there are, unlike the cannabis space where there is dual licensing, even if we issue a state license, that individual cannot operate their cannabis business until they also get that local approval or licensure. That does not apply here for natural medicine. Now, local jurisdictions do have authority to establish time, place, manner restrictions, and we expect a need to look at the locations of where somebody's contemplating operating one of these facilities. There are distance restrictions, like you have in cannabis, so you can't be like within 1,000 feet from a school or a daycare, a child care facility. So that's a restriction that applies to any of these facility locations. But also zoning, we're going to need to consider local zoning restrictions and how that informs where somebody can operate. But there isn't in the legislation, contemplated, local licensing program. And it does provide that while there is time, place, and manner authority for local jurisdictions, a local jurisdiction cannot prohibit the operation of a licensed facility and cannot prohibit the transfer, like transport of regulated natural medicine by licensees.
If I could just add real quickly on that, I think another important layer to this question about potential license caps and locations and things like that is the charge that Dominique touched on in statute that this is an equitable and inclusive program. And so really trying to balance the regulations we're putting in place. For example, if we were to put license caps in place, then what does that mean for how much a license may cost? And how are we making sure that we're considering and balancing these different perspectives on management of the number of licenses and also then the cost of entering this regulatory framework.
And I don't know if we have the numbers for Oregon. Like that's what we have looked to as an initial projection of what we might expect to see based on, even though Oregon is still new and it's relatively new in its program, is how many licenses they have operating.
So right now they have operating 9 healing centers, 3 cultivators and 2 testers. Can't recall the facilitator license, but I think they're anticipating 500 people to apply for licensure.
Okay. And even though we're looking at, Oregon is an initial sort of projection on what we can expect, knowing that there's still work being done there and ongoing interest, so there may be folks looking to still make their way and preparing to be a part of the regulatory program in Oregon. We also recognize that laws between Colorado and Oregon are very different, and that Colorado has a pretty broad personal use set of provisions, and it's unclear how that may impact interest and participation in the regulatory program. So that's something that we're going to need to be monitoring and just seeing how that gauges what we can expect or an interest in licensing, and also understanding where's the interest for participants to want to have an experience in a regulated space. Yes, and we can jump around here.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on what you're talking about with the prohibition of they can't prohibit moving product or any of that. So who's the authority on that?
So
under D.O.R.A.
So it's not necessarily I want to make sure I understand this. So we are going to also be responsible for regulating the transport between for any regulated natural medicine. So anything that's a part of transportation by people we're licensing. So it would be those entities, and it could also include employees of those entities, owners. So we anticipate licensure for individuals as well who are operating those facilities or working at those facilities. And if they're involved in the transportation of natural medicine from one location to another, that is where we have, we're going to need to stand up manifest requirements to support any sort of stop and law enforcement interaction to help, and also other methods just to help support that verification that it's a regulated transfer, and also see is there some other observation that we need to coordinate on or follow up on in an investigation. And so those are things that we will have regulatory responsibility over. Now, it doesn't mean that it's prohibiting, that the law prohibits law enforcement from stopping them. It's just a matter of not establishing an ordinance or resolution around, that prohibits transportation of natural medicine, of regulated natural medicine.
I was thinking more along the lines of enforcement of that. So would it be up to the local authorities, for example, if a community said, we're not going to allow any facilities like that or any healing centers in our community, who would be the enforcement? Would it be local law enforcement? Who would be the enforcement to make sure that that doesn't happen?
So if a local jurisdiction does establish, say, an ordinance that prohibits it, it would be a direct conflict with that statute. Mm-hmm. So it's something that at a minimum I could see if it's something that we learn about, would want to have, just reach out and have a conversation to make sure that we're educating on what the law provides and looking to engage with that local jurisdiction's local attorney, their counsel, to also inform those conversations. But we aren't the enforcement authority on that.
Right. I'm sorry, I have one more question if you don't mind. Just going back to access and the cost of licensing. For our communities, I live in Montezuma County, it's a very rural community, very low income community. The cost of some of these licenses for the healing centers are exorbitant for our area. There's no way that I can see a healing center can pay something like $10,000 a year when the participants aren't going to be able to even afford a therapy session. So is there going to be tier levels based on income of the community or financial picture of the community for those licensing? And if not, can I make a respectful request that that be considered?
Yeah, we do look forward to having you continue to be a part of our listening sessions and our rulemaking process, and everyone invited and encouraged to be a part of it.
we do need to consider fee setting, and this is it's going to be a part of our rulemaking. Same with the DORA is fee setting. What are the fees for getting the application and license fees for a facilitator? That's still under consideration, and where we'll see recommendations come from the advisory board for the Department of Revenue and those facilities. Similarly, we will be engaging in fee setting as a part of our rulemaking process, and those fees are ultimately, and this is established in the law, driven by the direct and indirect cost of the work that agency is engaging in through the application, licensing, and overall regulatory process. So regulation, enforcement, those are all things that we consider, and what does it take for us to monitor compliance, and what resources do we need? So we are a cash funded division, similar as it applies to marijuana, and the law establishes a cash fund. So this is a separate cash fund, and so that means that it's not supported by tax revenue. It is the operations of that agency are fully supported by fees that are established, but something that we very clearly are considering as a part of this is what are we seeing in Oregon? How are we standing up this agency in a way that we're not putting a bunch of resources in on the front end when we don't know what participation is going to look like? And a part of this is because of our work in the Marijuana Enforcement Division, we see efficiencies that we can leverage where we can look to the experience that we already have in cannabis within the Marijuana Enforcement Division, and how can we look to split that work in a way that a portion of the work that, say, for example, that I'm doing is dedicated to natural medicine, so that ties into the natural medicine cash fund. A percentage of the work I'm doing in the Marijuana Enforcement Division will be tied into that, what applies to the marijuana cash fund. And so we are looking to stand up this division, really starting small, incrementally, as we lead up to that licensing process and that fee setting process to make sure that we're not setting everything up for failure here by putting too many resources in on the front end. We're looking at those base, really critical requirements as a part of this program. How does that inform those direct and indirect costs that help decide what those fees need to look like?
And will those fees be tiered at all, do you think, or will it be kind of across the board?
So we want to make sure that we're looking at exploring this at all angles. So I think that's something that is absolutely open to discussion. How do we, if it's a larger operation compared to a very small operation, those are all going to inform how we look to determine, project what work is going to be involved, and how does that maybe inform distinctions between some of those fees, even if it's but they're both cultivations, but based on different considerations. Does that suggest that we might need to look at different fees based on certain factors?
Okay, great, thank you.
Thanks. I know we have a hand up here, and then we can go back here and then around.
I've got several questions. One, what is the website that you keep referring to that we can go to?
Do you want to? So natural medicine division, but you want to just give the actual?
Yeah, so it's NMD.
I'm sorry?
N as in natural. MD.colorado.gov. And if you can't find it through that URL, you can go to the Department of Revenue main homepage, and it's a big button that says natural medicine.
Okay. So another question. It's my understanding, based on what you said earlier, that a local jurisdiction cannot opt out of we were able to with marijuana. And is that a correct understanding?
That is correct.
And why is that?
It's under Senate Bill 290. I believe is reflective of what the original voter measure had in Proposition 122. So Senate Bill 290 maintained that provision based on the will of the voters of Colorado. And we're implementing.
How do we appeal that? Because I know my community is not happy about this. And we have a permanent ban on marijuana in my community because we don't want that either. So it feels forced upon us, and local control is being taken away.
And to be clear, the law still does very clearly establish
local time, place, manner, authority. So we do expect needs to partner with and engage with local jurisdictions to help navigate that process. But as far as an appeal process, this was established through the legislative process. And there were a number of stakeholders who I recall came forward and spoke about even concerns that you're raising. So it's really through the legislative process.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. I know, gentlemen, before we go to you, Pam, if it's okay, if it's holding. Do you have questions?
So with the licensing, is there going to be any type of certification or training prior to licensing, or is the individual just pay the fee and that's it?
Not the latter. We will be looking to, as Allison did touch on, the lead up through our rulemaking and how we're looking to make sure that rules are becoming effective early enough in time. So we're targeting October, right, for those final rules to become adopted in a way that gives us this runway to work with any prospective applicant to develop resources to support compliance, to make sure that we're contemplating what those operations are going to look like, how are we interacting with those prospective licensees, how are we working with any property owners who are looking to serve as operate for operations, natural medicine operations, how are we also engaging with local jurisdictions and our law enforcement partners on what those expectations are. So we want to really start, have that runway and engage in that work before we see any operations begin, so that we can support that overall compliance and awareness about what's happening across the state as we see any activity and leading up before that activity begins.
Are you talking about licensing of the facilitator or the facility?
Individual, before they take some sort of certification course.
For the facilitator?
For the facility.
Yes.
And then they get their license showing the certification.
So Sam is, and DORA is going to be licensing and regulating those facilitators, and there are direct expectations that there be training requirements established, and so that is contemplated.
That's something that we're discussing in qualifications, licensing, and training. We have some required training that in education that need to be a part of any approved training program. The approval of training programs is with DORA and the Division of Professions and Occupations, which approves other training programs. I think nursing is there as well. We've looked at Oregon's as well as kind of a baseline, but from the testimony that we heard, we'll probably have some expanded educational requirements as well as practicum, hours, observance, and as well as annual training, right, on state law, ethics, and additional pieces as further information comes out.
Kind of related to that, on the for the licensed facilitators, there's a number of companies and organizations that will provide training currently, so that you can say that I am a psilocybin facilitator or an integration coach therapist. Anybody who has gone through these training programs and now hold whatever license, what is the validity of that, and how are you going to tie the state regulations into the training programs that either already exist or the ones to come to be? There's a ton of people are licensed already or think they are. They've got a certificate that says, I can give you drugs and watch you.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It's a challenge that has come up. I mean, one of the things that we focused on early on was integrating some of the folks that have approved training programs in Oregon or have operated in the space prior to 122 to see kind of what the landscape is like. Because the training programs really vary, the cohorts, the training methods, right? And it's something that we are looking at and evaluating, right? I think there's another piece on this, right, with facilitators who've been doing this for many years safely, responsibly, and how do we honor that, as well as the indigenous and native communities who have tribal colleges. So really integrating that and potentially offering some form of accelerated training if there's some like MAPS training, right? And there's courses out there, so it's a hard piece to put together, but it's something that that subcommittee and the board is really looking at.
And just kind of follow up is like, how tightly tied are these training centers, certifications, however we're going to do it, how tightly tied is that going to be to existing mental health practices as far as psychotherapy or psychiatry, right? Like, do you have to be, a full, 4-year grad student or something in order to get your certification in order to be a facilitator? And that would be like kind of extreme on one side, or can you just, take a pop psychology course on the internet and then have that tie into the actual training itself? You just need a fair balance between the two without, kind of going to each side as an extreme. Like you say, respecting the people who have done it for a long time, the Native American communities and things of that nature. I think that they might have more experience and understanding in this arena than, some guy down the street who's used to, getting $300 an hour to listen to someone's life problems, So is there a lot of look being going into that, and do you have any kind of
nothing has been formalized yet and submitted to the agency. It's part of the discussions.
Gotcha.
I think that's honestly the goal for October for that subcommittee is to really nail down the educational requirements, the core training as well. And I think that also comes into our discussion on the tiered licensure structure, right? I think what we've done, and there's other programs like Mendiola out there, right? There's people who've been sitters. There's many people who've been doing this in the underground space as more of a therapeutic model, right? So it's really kind of putting those pieces together and which license and how that interacts with it, and as well as the training programs, making sure that they're meeting those requirements.
Right. So I guess my concern is just just knowing that that currently there's kind of this feeling in the area or in the arena that that this is some kind of a new magic thing where you just do it and everything's fine, but it has to come alongside at least a comprehensive understanding of the person's wants, needs, and the end result of that, and that it does take work for the individual to get where they're going, and this isn't just a quick fix that you go in and you're fine. And how would I get more involved in actually helping out more with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I've actually put my card as well as the program's card up there. We can chat after this, but send me an email.
Absolutely.
We have the public meetings, we have board meetings 6 times a month. But not next week, because next week we have emergency response safety and ethics and public health and health equity and indigenous and religious use. But the following week we're going to be diving into products research and data, qualifications, licensing, and training, and the full board meeting. But we are always looking for feedback and just what are we missing in these discussions? Like what is not being discussed? What is not being considered in the recommendations or the priority questions that we're kind of doing?
Thank you, and well done on kind of taking a second look at ibogaine. It's a little dangerous to be shoving around.
I can hear from you, and we want to make our way back here. Okay. Yes.
One question: how does this conflict with federal scheduling?
Yes, it does. Just like cannabis. Yes.
Okay.
Which is why it's a cash thing, right? Or partly.
It is still a Schedule I controlled substance, as is cannabis. Okay. Yes, sir. And then
I'm going to switch topics a little here to cultivation. Given that mushrooms are cultivated wildly differently than marijuana, what do you imagine a cultivation facility to look like? Because it doesn't really need to be a farm, so to speak.
Yeah, that is exactly what we're gaining insights on in our listening sessions, including from folks here. And so Erica here has provided a lot of input to us, insights, and what we should be thinking about. Other stakeholders have provided insights around just what they have learned about, or based on their experience, expertise in the space. We know that there are really big distinctions, even in where we expect a space for growing cannabis is going to be very different when we're thinking about maybe vertical integration that would apply to
natural medicine, certain natural medicine like psilocybin. And so those are all things that we are continuing to learn about, but we anticipate varying sizes and types of operations. There may be some folks who, for example, want to operate a healing center and have their own manufacturing, their own cultivation and manufacturing operations that are tied to that, and that could be smaller. There could be somebody who just wants to engage in the production process, so is only involved in cultivation or only involved in manufacturing, and then partnering with healing centers to provide the regulated natural medicine. And so that's where we may expect a larger, at least attempted production compared to smaller operations. So those are all things that we still are learning about and understanding those very big distinctions between cannabis and natural medicine.
So just to follow up on the licensing piece, I'm curious about if there's any sense of how, like if there's going to be a certain number of hours, and I'm sure there's been discussion about that. And the other piece is there going to be a time limit from when that training is done to when the licensing application is completed? Because, a lot is available. And so, like, just in terms of making decisions about training, how that's going to apply to a license.
Yeah, I know that's all still getting worked through, like as it applies to facilitators, where there are clear directives for training requirements to be established. That is all still under discussion, and that's where a lot of our answers are, it still remains to be seen, but we are engaging early in this process. We wanted to start these types of engagement and outreach and sharing this information early in before we have those answers, because we need stakeholders to be a part of the process to help inform what that really needs to look like, and make sure we're considering recommendations from folks that have lived experience, the expertise, and also concerns that people have that we can make sure we're being responsive to. So still open, and those are, I think, actively being discussed in the DORA facilitated board meetings. So would suggest that, recognizing again, like we want to encourage folks to be tracking our work, and for the Department of Regulatory Agencies, that's SAM, and for us, that's Department of Revenue, Natural Medicine Division. There are two different tracks right now that are going on. We are not conflicting on that. We're working closely together to make sure that anyone who wants to be a part of both processes and track both, that they have every opportunity to do that.
Right, so hopefully there's some flexibility, in terms of folks who have decided that this is going to be a benefit to people and are, wanting to do it above board, right? Because I think the main advantage of that is that the consumer has some reassurance, right, about the kind of service they're getting.
Yeah, and that also touches on, like, one, what are those regulatory requirements, training requirements that are under development, but also considering our regulatory responsibilities. How are we prioritizing our focus around compliance, looking at a risk-based approach to where we're deploying resources, working proactively to support a culture of compliance that prevents harms from happening rather than reacting to harms or anything bad happening. And so we're really approaching it through that lens.
Yeah, great. And by the way, you picked a great time to come to Durango.
Okay, I have a couple of questions. So I hold space for a nonprofit organization here locally where we educate surrounding a lot of these topics. And so I'm hit with a lot of questions and I don't know how to answer them necessarily, and we have a lot of conversations. So I guess my first question will shift it over to, I've been asked, DMT has been legalized. Is that in the form of ayahuasca specifically, or is that isolated substance?
So DM, yeah, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, so I'm pretty sure it's no synthetics. I think it has to be a very natural product, right?
Sam, I think it is synthetic. Yeah, and the reason why is because 5-MeO-DMT is a natural substance. It's usually extracted from an endangered Colorado desert toad, or river toad, I believe it is. Is it the Colorado River toad?
There is one here, yeah.
And that's 5-MeO-DMT. And so I think the same thing with peyote is that we don't want to, endanger them further. Yeah, so I think it is DMT, which is typically synthetic, and I may be wrong on that, but it's a topic that's kind of
we do want to. I think that is something we'll need to dive into further. Recognizing the regulatory program is only beginning until 2026. There can be considerations, recommendations from the advisory board to introduce these other natural medicines as a part of the regulatory program. There is an ability for ibogaine to come into the regulatory program earlier in time, but again, it requires a recommendation by the advisory board and then consideration by the departments as to whether, for example, do we need a whole new set of regulations, or do we need like in certain sections? How are we contemplating that? Do we have appropriate resources to implement and properly regulate, make sure we're fulfilling our responsibility? So those are things we are needing to consider. But there is a provision in the law that provides that natural medicine does not mean just at a high level, anything that involves chemical conversion. Or any synthesis, anything that involves chemical modification or conversion would not be included as a natural medicine. But I think we need to take a closer look at DMT and how that, what that entails, just specifically to see if there's any conflict there and how we navigate that.
Mescaline is a synthetic version, right?
It can be, yeah.
It can be, but may not. Is there another natural derivative? Okay.
Yeah.
So hopping off of what you just said with conversion and whatnot, some conversions are like saying putting psilocybin into honey. Honey starts to convert the psilocybin into psilocin, or lemon juice or any kind of acid will do that. And, I'm an educator, so I tell people, the easiest way and the most bioavailable ways with something like that, so that it breaks down the chitin and things like that, and helping for better absorption and all of those things. Would that be considered a conversion?
I think imagine it contemplates a distinction between that as you look at the more specific language on chemical like an active process that involves chemical modification.
Right.
But that's something, and it's a good flag for us as a part of what sort of educational resources are we putting out there, even if it's not a part of the regulated program yet, and how do we prepare for the potential of these becoming a part of the regulated program? So where do we provide more clarity and guidance, and what also do we need to flag for potential future legislative clarity, and where we can make recommendations for consideration by the General Assembly on areas that may need more clarity.
Sure, because natural conversion that way is different than, say, creating like a psilocin tablet, that's just pure psilocin. I had another question, and it has to do with a conversation that has come up, and I find it an interesting one, having to do with, we have a cap on 21 and up, having access to these types of medicines. Now, we know with alcohol and even with cannabis, it interacts with us in a lot of different ways, but speaking to the topic of teenage suicides and things of that nature, we've had a lot of that happening, even with COVID hitting and things of that nature. And we also know that in different indigenous cultures in the world, these things are approached in different ways. So I know that we're at the baby steps of just getting these laws in order, but it's just something to consider in the future. How do maybe making things like that accessible to people who actually need it, like say if someone is suicidal and let's just say they're 16, 17 years old, would they have access to that medicine? And that's just, an area of conversation to consider.
Sure. Yeah, and that would ultimately involve, a legislative discussion or consideration. Unlike for cannabis, there is that opportunity with a medical marijuana patient and a pathway for individuals under 21 to have access. And so it is very different in that regard, where this program is specifically limited to 21 and up, but we'll see how things evolve over time and what we learn along the way. But another piece that I think is important that you had touched on in your comment was how we are collecting data and how we're reporting that out. And a lesson learned around cannabis is the challenges we had with establishing baseline data before everything started getting underway. And so reflecting on that experience, we are already wanting to hear from members of the community about what areas of data we should be thinking about, what organizations are out there we should be partnering with, poison control. We've already had conversations there. What are their partner agencies we should be working with?
to look at what data is available, what are we already required under the law to report, and where are there gaps, and where should we, even if it's not directed by the law, where should we be making sure we're informing any sort of areas that we know we or others will be interested in tracking around the impacts of a regulatory program, or even the personal use provisions and how that impacts just what we see here in Colorado. And with our cannabis program, we did not, it's challenging to distinguish between data and what applies to the regulated marijuana and what is occurring outside of that space, and oftentimes just gets attributed to having a regulatory program. And so we want to make sure we're reflecting on those lessons and seeing what are we doing as we stand up this program to make sure that we're working to get ahead of that and have robust, accurate, informative data. All right, I think we're over time.
Yeah, let's just try a little bit.
I just have one quick question.
Oh, yes, sir.
Going back to the conversion stuff, are we going to be allowed to do extractions of psilocybin?
So we do anticipate in our manufacturing and cultivation session that we just held yesterday, we were asking questions around what are the range of products we can expect. We did touch on that synthetic prohibition piece, but what else would we expect to where there's interest? And we did ask the question around, because there was mention of oils, and so it's like, is that extraction? Is that like concentrate type of product? So we still need to learn more about what we should expect and what sort of limitations there should be on the products that are allowed to be available in the regulated space, but also what should there be allowances for, and appropriate guardrails, regulatory, like health and safety provisions around like substances, chemicals that are being used, things like that. Thank you so much. We appreciate your presence here and hope that you continue to track our work and continue to be a part of this process. We appreciate your time. Thank you.